In the quiet aftermath of the Great Flood, nestled within the sparse verses of Genesis chapter 9, lies one of the most disturbing and seemingly unjust moments in the entire biblical narrative. We see Noah, the hero of the flood, planting a vineyard. He drinks its wine, becomes drunk, and lies uncovered in his tent. His son, Ham, enters and sees his father's nakedness. When Noah awakens and learns what has happened, a curse is pronounced. But the curse does not fall upon Ham, the son who committed the act. Instead, Noah looks past him into the future and unleashes the full weight of his judgment upon his grandson, an innocent party named Canaan. Why? Why would a grandson be made to bear the punishment for his father's transgression? Does this sound like the act of a righteous God, or does it feel more like the erratic, angry outburst of a patriarch shamed in a moment of drunken vulnerability? For centuries, this passage has been a stumbling block for believers and a point of attack for skeptics. It appears arbitrary, cruel, and deeply unfair. It paints a picture of a God who punishes the innocent, a foundational story stained by a moment of baffling injustice. But what if the story as we know it is not the full story? What if this apparent injustice is not a flaw in the divine character, but a clue that the true crime was far greater than a glance in a tent? What if the official record has been altered, the key evidence removed, and the identity of the real perpetrator skillfully obscured? We are not just reading an ancient story today. We are investigating a legal verdict that appears to have condemned the wrong man. And that investigation begins by treating this moment of injustice not as a mystery to be accepted, but as the first piece of evidence in a case that will unravel the forbidden history of the world's first and most consequential crime. To understand the crime, we must first understand the scene. Imagine the world as Noah and his family saw it when they stepped from the ark onto the damp soil of Mount Ararat. It was a world washed clean, silent, and empty. The cacophony of the old civilization, the cities built by Cain's line, the fortresses of the Nephilim, the sounds of violence and corruption had been silenced beneath a global sea of judgment. Now, there was only the whistle of the wind through barren valleys, the rush of new rivers carving their paths to the sea, and the immense, humbling quiet of a planet given a second chance. This was not a world for the timid. It was a blank slate, an empty canvas that held both terrifying emptiness and boundless promise. Noah and his sons were not merely survivors, they were the designated founders of a new human race. Upon their shoulders rested the weight of rebuilding not just families and settlements, but the very covenant relationship between humanity and its creator. Their first actions, their first decisions would set the course for all of history to come. In this pristine post-diluvian dawn, the first priority was not a chaotic scramble for land or a rush to claim the best territory. It was a sacred and deliberate process of re-establishing order. The ground beneath their feet still glistened with the memory of divine judgment, and the rainbow that stretched across the sky was a constant, visible reminder of a new covenant, a new set of rules. The survivors understood that the chaos that had drowned the old world was born from the violation of divine boundaries. Therefore, the new world had to be built upon a foundation of holy, unshakable order. Before the first seed was planted, before the first city was planned, there was a period of waiting, of listening for divine instruction on how this new world was to be governed, how it was to be divided, and how its peace was to be preserved. They were not just building a civilization, they were participating in a second creation. To understand what truly happened in Noah's tent and to grasp the magnitude of the crime that was committed, we must once again move beyond the curated summary of Genesis. The canonical text gives us the event, but it withholds the context. It shows us the curse, but it hides the legal framework that made that curse both just and necessary. To find that missing framework, we must turn to our key witness, the text that preserves the heavenly perspective on earthly events. We must unseal the Book of Jubilees. As we have established, Jubilees is not just another ancient story. It claims to be a direct transcript of a heavenly record, a divine chronicle dictated to Moses by an angel. Its purpose is not to replace Genesis, but to illuminate it, to provide the crucial details and the cosmic context that the later editors chose to omit. When it comes to the story of Noah's sons and the curse of Canaan, the role of Jubilees is paramount. It acts as a legal commentary, revealing the divine laws and sacred agreements that were in place long before the events of Genesis chapter 9 unfolded. It is in the pages of Jubilees that we discover the why behind the curse. We move from a confusing family drama to a crystal-clear legal proceeding. The book provides the backstory of a sacred oath, a divine partition of the earth, and a willful act of rebellion that Genesis leaves entirely in the shadows. To ignore the testimony of Jubilees is to be content with reading the verdict of a trial without ever being allowed to hear the evidence or the law upon which that verdict was based. Today, we enter the courtroom. We will hear the law as it was written on the heavenly tablets, and we will see the evidence that transforms a seemingly unjust curse into a righteous and inevitable sentence. The Book of Jubilees reveals a moment of profound and sacred order that took place long before Noah planted his vineyard. This event is the missing key, the foundational piece of context that changes everything. In the years after the flood, as his family began to grow, Noah did not leave the division of the world to chance, nor to the ambitions of his sons. Under the direct guidance of an angel, he performed a solemn and binding ceremony to partition the entire earth. According to the 8th and 9th chapters of Jubilees, this was not a human negotiation. It was a divine charter. Noah brought his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, together, and by the casting of lots, a practice used to discern the will of heaven, he divided the known world into 3 distinct inheritances. The text describes this sacred map with the precision of a legal deed, naming rivers, coastlines, and mountains as holy boundaries. To Japheth, the lot gave the cold lands of the north, stretching across Europe and into the frozen wastes. To Ham, the lot gave the hot lands to the south, the vast and fertile continent of Africa. And to Shem, the blessed line through which the covenant would continue, the lot gave the central portion of the earth, a temperate and sacred territory described as stretching from the Middle East to the very site of the Garden of Eden, with Mount Zion at its heart. This was not a simple division of real estate. It was a spiritual demarcation, a divinely ordained geography where each lineage was assigned a specific role and a specific territory in the unfolding drama of God's plan. The map was drawn not by human hands, but by the will of heaven. The boundaries were set, the destinies were assigned. And this sacred partition, witnessed by the angels and recorded in the heavenly tablets, was then sealed with an unbreakable oath. The divine partition of the earth was not merely an administrative act, it was a covenant. And like all sacred covenants, it was sealed with the gravest of words, a solemn and binding oath. The Book of Jubilees records the moment that Noah gathered his sons after the lots had been cast and their inheritances assigned. He made them swear one by one before the throne of heaven itself that they would honor the sacred boundaries that had just been established. Imagine the scene. The patriarch, his face etched with the memory of a world drowned by lawlessness, looks into the eyes of his sons, the future of all humanity. The air is thick with the weight of their responsibility. He makes them swear that they will each remain in the lands allotted to them, that they will not seek to seize the inheritance of their brothers through violence or deception. They swear to live in peace, to respect the divine map, and to teach their children to do the same for all generations. And then a curse is pronounced. Not a curse from Noah, but a curse embedded into the very fabric of the oath itself. They agreed together that whoever sought to take a portion that had not fallen to him by lot would be cursed. He and his sons would fall before their brothers. They would be rooted out, and their seed would vanish from the face of the earth. This was the law of the new world. The oath was sealed. The boundaries were no longer just lines on a map. They were lines of covenant, protected by the promise of blessing for obedience and the certainty of a curse for transgression. To cross the border of a brother's land was no longer just an act of war. It was an act of blasphemy. It was a direct rebellion against the established order of heaven. The stage was now set. The rules were crystal clear. And it is with the knowledge of this unbreakable oath that the true crime of Canaan is about to be revealed. With the sacred map drawn and the unbreakable oath sealed, the sons of Noah dispersed to their allotted inheritances. Japheth's children went north. Shem's children settled in the center of the earth. And Ham, along with his sons Cush, Mizraim, Phut, and Canaan, journeyed south into the lands of Africa that were their divine portion. For a time, the covenant of peace held. But the Book of Jubilees, in its 10th chapter, records the moment of the first great rebellion against this new world order. And the perpetrator was not Ham. It was his youngest son, Canaan. The text is explicit and damning. It tells us that Canaan saw the land of Lebanon, the fertile river valleys stretching to the border of Egypt, and he coveted it. He saw that it was good, and his heart was filled with the desire to possess what was not his. He knew this land was the inheritance of Shem, a territory at the very heart of the central portion of the earth. His father, Ham, and his brothers all warned him, pleading with him to honor the oath and to settle in his own inheritance to the south. "You will be cursed if you do this," they told him, reminding him of the solemn agreement they had all made. But Canaan refused to listen. The Chronicle states, "He would not hearken unto them, and dwelt in the land of Lebanon, from Hamath to the entering of Egypt, he and his sons until this day." And for this reason, that land is named Canaan. This is the hidden crime. This is the truth that Genesis buries in silence. The sin that triggered the curse was not an accidental glimpse of nakedness in a tent. It was a calculated, willful, and arrogant act of insurrection against the divinely established order of the world. Canaan was the first squatter, the first illegal settler, the first man to build his house on stolen ground. He did not just cross a boundary, he trampled a covenant. And in doing so, he brought upon himself and his descendants the very curse that his father and uncles had sworn would befall any who broke the sacred oath. The curse was not an invention of Noah's anger. It was an activation of a pre-existing legal sentence. With this forbidden history restored, we can now return to the cryptic scene in Noah's tent and see it with new eyes. The event described in Genesis is no longer an isolated incident, but the dramatic climax of a story that had already been unfolding. Ham's act of looking upon his father's nakedness and then mockingly telling his brothers was not the root cause of the curse. It was a symptom. It was the moment that the latent spirit of rebellion within his lineage was made manifest. Think of it this way. Ham's disrespect for his father's authority was the precursor to Canaan's disrespect for God's authority. The father's failure to honor the sacred space of the family tent mirrored the son's failure to honor the sacred boundaries of the world. The Book of Jubilees suggests that this spirit of dishonor, this inclination toward rebellion, was a spiritual inheritance passed from Ham to Canaan. While Ham's transgression was one of mockery and shame, Canaan took that same spirit and escalated it into an act of cosmic treason. Therefore, when Noah awakens from his wine, he is not just an angry father. He is a prophet. His words are not a spontaneous curse born of personal shame. They are a divine verdict, a prophetic insight into the future consequences of the rebellious seed he has just witnessed in both his son and grandson. He sees that the spirit of Ham, which manifested as disrespect, has fully blossomed in Canaan as an act of territorial theft and covenant breaking. So he does not curse Ham, whose sin was personal. He curses Canaan, whose sin was foundational and would have lasting geopolitical consequences for all of history. The curse, "A servant of servants shall he be to his brethren," was not just a sentence for a family misdeed. It was the legal and spiritual consequence for stealing the inheritance of his uncle, Shem, and for planting a seed of defiance in the very heart of the promised land. The scene in the tent was not the beginning of the crime. It was the moment the verdict was read aloud. We have now seen the evidence. We have uncovered the lost context of the sacred partition and the cosmic crime of Canaan. The question that logically follows is the one that lies at the heart of our entire investigation. Why? Why would the later scribes and editors of Genesis remove this entire crucial backstory? Why would they take a clear, legally grounded story of a covenant transgression and transform it into a confusing, morally ambiguous family drama? The answer lies in the deeply unsettling and politically explosive nature of the truth itself. To include the story of the divine partition of the earth, as recorded in Jubilees, is to make a staggering theological claim that the rights to certain lands, particularly the Holy Land, are not determined by conquest, by treaty, or by human history, but by a divine decree issued at the dawn of the post-flood world. For the gatekeepers of Scripture, living in periods of political turmoil, exile, and foreign domination, this was a dangerous and double-edged sword. On one hand, it provided a powerful theological justification for Israel's claim to the land of Canaan. But on the other hand, it established a rigid, unchangeable standard that could be used to judge Israel's own faithfulness. More importantly, it presented a version of history that was fundamentally supernatural, a story where borders were drawn by angels and curses were activated by oaths. For a world that was becoming increasingly political and secular, this raw, mystical history was a liability. It was a truth too wild to be tamed, too absolute to be negotiated with. The most significant consequence of erasing the story of the sacred partition was the effect it had on the narrative of Israel's conquest of Canaan. In the simplified version of Genesis, the story moves from the patriarchs to Egyptian slavery, and then to a divine command for Joshua to invade and conquer a land inhabited by numerous tribes. Read without the context of Jubilees. This conquest can appear as a brutal, morally complex military campaign, an act of divine favoritism that leads to the violent displacement of native peoples. It is a story that has been a source of profound theological and ethical struggle for centuries. But by removing the backstory of Canaan's crime, the gatekeepers of Scripture effectively sanitized the conquest. They stripped it of its legal and theological justification. The full story, as preserved by Jubilees, reframes the entire event. The conquest of Canaan by Joshua is no longer an invasion. It is a repossession. It is not an act of aggression, but an act of righteous eviction. The Israelites were not simply invaders taking a land that was not theirs. They were the rightful heirs, returning to reclaim a divine inheritance that had been illegally occupied by the descendants of Canaan for centuries. This context does not erase the violence of the conquest, but it fundamentally changes its moral and spiritual character. It transforms the campaign from a morally ambiguous war into the execution of a long-standing divine sentence. The later scribes, perhaps in an attempt to create a less confrontational or politically charged history, chose to present a story of moral ambiguity rather than one of theological clarity. They made Israel's actions appear more aggressive in order to make the history of the land more negotiable. In doing so, they protected the narrative from external criticism, but they did so at the cost of obscuring the very foundation of Israel's claim to the land. The editorial decision to remove the cosmic backstory of Canaan's crime was a masterful act of narrative transformation. The gatekeepers took a story that was vast, legalistic, and cosmic in scale, and they successfully reduced it to a small, intimate, and profoundly confusing family drama. Think of the elements they removed. They took out the angelic guidance, the casting of lots to determine the will of heaven, the drawing of a sacred world map with divine boundaries, and the swearing of a solemn, curse-laden oath. All of these elements point to a world governed by a clear, supernatural order, a world where actions have direct and predictable covenantal consequences. By excising this entire legal and spiritual framework, they left behind only the raw, emotional core of the story: a father's shame, a son's disrespect, and a grandfather's seemingly misplaced anger. They replaced a courtroom with a tent. They substituted a broken covenant for a moment of family dishonor, and in doing so, they achieved a critical goal. They shifted the focus away from the uncomfortable and absolute nature of divine law and onto the more relatable and more easily debated realm of human fallibility. A story about a legal sentence for a cosmic crime is a story that demands a verdict on God's unchanging order. A story about a family squabble is a story that invites endless psychological speculation. The gatekeepers chose the latter. They chose the path of ambiguity, and in doing so, they successfully hid the true reason behind one of the most enduring and explosive conflicts in all of human history. This censored history is not just an ancient curiosity. It is a living reality whose echoes still reverberate in the modern world. The conflict over the Holy Land, which we see on our news screens every day, is, through this restored theological lens, not a modern political dispute that began in the 20th century. It is the continuation of a spiritual and territorial struggle that began with a single act of rebellion in the shadow of Mount Ararat. The sacred map, though erased from our Bibles, was never erased from the heavenly record. The divine decree that assigned the central portion of the earth to the lineage of Shem remains, in this worldview, an unalterable reality. The crime of Canaan, the illegal occupation of that sacred inheritance, created a spiritual fracture in the very soil of the land, a fracture that has never fully healed. This perspective does not simplify the modern conflict, nor does it endorse any particular political solution. But it does provide a profound and sobering theological context. It suggests that the wars, the treaties, the seemingly endless cycles of violence are not merely the product of human politics and religious strife. They are the long, tragic echo of a broken covenant, a physical manifestation of a spiritual wound that was inflicted at the dawn of the new world. The borders may have shifted on the maps of men, the empires may have risen and fallen, but the original sacred boundaries established after the flood have never, in the eyes of heaven, been moved. The land itself remembers who its rightful heirs are, and the struggle we witness today is a testament to the enduring consequences of that first forbidden act of trespassing. With this restored knowledge, we are now invited to reread the entire story of the conquest of Canaan with new eyes. The Book of Joshua, which can often be one of the most morally challenging books in the entire Bible, is suddenly illuminated. The command from God to drive out the inhabitants of the land is no longer an arbitrary decree of divine favoritism or a command for ethnic cleansing. It is the execution of a legal eviction notice that had been pending for centuries. When the Israelite spies enter Jericho, they are not foreign invaders. They are scouts surveying a stolen inheritance. When the walls of Jericho fall, it is not just a military miracle. It is the symbolic dismantling of a stronghold built on a foundation of cosmic rebellion. Each battle that Joshua fights is not an act of aggression, but an act of reclamation, a systematic retaking of land that was divinely deeded to the lineage of Shem, their ancestor. This does not remove the difficulty or the violence of the story, but it reframes its purpose entirely. It provides the missing legal and theological justification that the Genesis account obscures. God was not commanding an unprovoked invasion. He was acting as the divine arbiter of a covenant, the enforcer of an oath that was broken long ago. The Canaanite tribes were being judged not for their ethnicity, but for the foundational crime of their forefather, a crime that their own continued idolatry and wickedness had only compounded over the centuries. This perspective is not intended to excuse the bloodshed. It is intended to explain the divine verdict that precipitated it. The conquest was not the beginning of a war. It was the end of a long and patient legal process. The story of Canaan's transgression and its long, bloody aftermath teaches us more than just a piece of forgotten history. It reveals a foundational principle of the cosmic order. The universe is built on sacred boundaries. These are not just the geographical lines drawn on a celestial map, but the moral, ethical, and spiritual perimeters that define our relationship with the Creator and with creation itself. The crime of Canaan was, at its heart, a refusal to accept a limit. It was the belief that his own desire, his own ambition, trumped the divine order that had been established. This same spiritual impulse is the root of all sin. When Adam and Eve reached for the fruit of the forbidden tree, they were crossing a sacred boundary, a limit set not to restrict them, but to define their relationship of trust with God. When the Watchers descended from heaven to take human wives, they were violating the sacred boundary between the celestial and terrestrial realms. The story of Canaan demonstrates that this principle of sacred boundaries extends to all of creation. There are lines we are not meant to cross. There are inheritances that do not belong to us. There are authorities we are meant to honor. To live righteously is to learn to live within these divinely appointed limits, to find freedom not in boundless expansion, but in joyful submission to the Creator's design. Canaan's curse was the direct and inevitable consequence of his trespass. It serves as an eternal warning that to defy these sacred boundaries is to invite chaos, conflict, and ultimately judgment. The principle is universal and unchanging. It echoes from the stolen lands of the ancient world to the moral compromises of our own time. To live a blessed life is to learn where the lines are drawn and to have the wisdom and humility not to cross them. This restored context also allows us to rescue the character of God from the caricature that the simplified Genesis narrative can create. By removing the legal backstory, the curse of Noah can be misinterpreted as the angry, disproportionate reaction of a flawed patriarch, a curse that God passively allows to stand. It can make God seem arbitrary, even unjust, complicit in the punishment of an innocent for the crime of another. But the fuller story from Jubilees reframes the entire event. Noah's words are no longer a drunken outburst. They are a prophetic declaration of a pre-existing legal reality. He is not inventing a curse out of personal anger. He is speaking the consequence that was already embedded in the oath that Canaan's lineage chose to violate. Noah acts as a prophet, a mouthpiece for the divine court, verbalizing the verdict for a crime that had already been committed. This transforms our understanding of God's role in the story. God is no longer a passive observer of a family squabble. He is the ultimate author and guarantor of the sacred covenant that partitioned the earth. The curse is not a reflection of his temper, but of his unwavering commitment to justice and order. His character is not diminished, it is magnified. He is revealed not as a capricious deity who punishes on a whim, but as a cosmic judge who takes oaths seriously, who honors boundaries, and whose legal framework governs the destiny of nations. The story, once a source of theological discomfort, becomes a powerful testament to the unshakable and consistent justice of the Creator. The restoration of this sacred history, with its focus on covenant, land, and lineage, ultimately points forward to its final and complete fulfillment. The curse that fell upon Canaan was a curse of servitude and displacement, born from his attempt to seize a physical inheritance that was not his. But the lineage of Shem, the rightful heir to that inheritance, carried forward a promise that was far greater than any single piece of land. It was the promise of a coming Redeemer. Centuries later, from that very same lineage of Shem, Jesus Christ was born. He did not come as a military conqueror to reclaim a small strip of territory in the Middle East. He came as the ultimate king, the true heir of all creation, to reclaim the entire world from the curse of transgression that had begun not just with Canaan, but with Adam. The principle of sacred boundaries which Canaan violated finds its perfect expression in Jesus. He is the one who never crossed a line, who lived in perfect submission to the Father's will, who honored every divine decree. And by his obedience, he reversed the curse of disobedience. The curse of Canaan was to be a servant of servants. Jesus, the King, willingly became the servant of all, washing the feet of his disciples, and in doing so, broke the power of the curse. Through his death and resurrection, he did not just offer forgiveness. He began the great act of repossession, reclaiming a world that had been illegally occupied by the forces of darkness. The promise is no longer about a physical plot of land, but about a spiritual kingdom. And the invitation to enter that kingdom is extended to all people from all lineages, Shem, Ham, and Japheth alike. The curse that was born from a stolen inheritance is ultimately healed by the free gift of an eternal one, offered by the one true King who came to reclaim it all. So, what was truly hidden when the gatekeepers erased the crime of Canaan from the Genesis account? They did not just remove a few inconvenient verses about a land dispute. They concealed a foundational doctrine about the very nature of reality. They hid the truth that the earth has a sacred architecture, a divine blueprint that was established at the dawn of the new world. They hid the idea that nations and peoples have a divinely appointed destiny, and that to defy that destiny is to declare war not just on one's neighbors, but on heaven itself. They hid the legal framework that makes sense of the subsequent history of Israel, transforming a story of righteous reclamation into a morally ambiguous tale of conquest. Most importantly, they hid the profound and sobering truth that history is not a random, chaotic sequence of human actions. It is the slow, deliberate unfolding of a divine plan, a story governed by sacred covenants, unbreakable oaths, and inevitable consequences. They took a world that was mapped, ordered, and infused with divine purpose, and they presented us with a world that was blank, chaotic, and seemingly governed only by the whims of men. They chose to give us a story of human politics because they feared the staggering implications of a story about cosmic law. And in making that choice, they left us to wander in a world without a map, unaware of the ancient boundaries we may still be trespassing upon today. Imagine for a moment how differently we would see the world if this sacred map had never been hidden. Imagine living with the knowledge that the ground beneath your feet is not neutral territory, but a space with a designated spiritual purpose, a history recorded in the heavenly courts. How would it change our understanding of politics and international relations? Conflicts over borders would no longer be seen as mere geopolitical struggles for resources or power, but as potential echoes of an ancient spiritual dispute. The concept of manifest destiny or national ambition would be held against the sobering reality of a divine charter, forcing us to ask not, what can we take, but what were we given? How would it change our understanding of our own role in the world? We would see ourselves not as random inhabitants of a chaotic planet, but as heirs to a specific lineage, whether Shem, Ham, or Japheth, with a unique inheritance and a unique responsibility within God's global design. The call to love thy neighbor would take on a new, profound meaning. A call to respect the sacred boundaries and the divine portion that has been given to others. To live in a world with a map is to live with a sense of profound accountability. It is to know that our actions, as nations and as individuals, are being measured against an original design. It is a world where history has a purpose, geography has a meaning, and every conflict carries the weight of a potential covenant transgression. This is the world that the Book of Jubilees describes, and it is a world that the gatekeepers, perhaps fearing its awesome and demanding clarity, chose to conceal from us. The sacred map was buried, but it was not destroyed. The angelic chronicle was silenced, but its words were not erased. For centuries, this forbidden history waited patiently, preserved in the arid caves by the Dead Sea, and guarded in the ancient monasteries of Ethiopia, waiting for a generation that would be ready to look again. And that generation is now. The choice is no longer in the hands of the ancient gatekeepers. The evidence has been brought into the light. You have now heard the testimony of the silenced witness. You have seen the divine map. You understand the true crime of Canaan and the cosmic justice behind the curse. The choice now passes to you. You can choose to return to the world without a map. You can continue to see history as a random series of human events, to view the curse of Canaan as an uncomfortable mystery, and to accept the simplified, sanitized version of the story that tradition has handed down. It is a safer, more comfortable path, one that demands little of you but passive acceptance. Or you can make a different choice. You can choose to live as if the map is real. You can begin the journey of seeing the world through this restored theological lens. This is the path of the spiritual archaeologist, a path that requires the courage to re-examine everything you thought you knew, to hold tradition up to the light of a more ancient record, and to accept the profound and often unsettling responsibilities that come with knowing that every inch of this world has a sacred story and a divine purpose. The map is before you. The choice of which world you will live in is yours. We began our investigation today in the shadow of a profound injustice, a grandson cursed for the sin of his father. We followed the trail of that mystery away from the familiar pages of Genesis and into the forbidden history preserved in the Book of Jubilees. There, we did not find a clarification. We found a complete reframing of reality. We uncovered the existence of a sacred world map, a divine partition of the earth sealed by an unbreakable oath. We identified the true crime, not a moment of disrespect in a tent, but a calculated act of cosmic trespassing by Canaan, who willfully stole the inheritance of Shem. We saw how Noah's curse was not an outburst of anger, but the prophetic declaration of a legal sentence. And we exposed the motives of the gatekeepers who chose to bury this explosive truth, transforming a story of cosmic law into a confusing family drama to create a more politically palatable and theologically simple narrative. We have presented the evidence. We have summoned the silenced witness. We have restored the context that has been missing for millennia. The case file is now open for your consideration. The verdict, as always, is yours to render. We have shown you the map. The decision of whether to believe it and what to do with that knowledge now rests with you. The curse of Canaan was never about the shame of nakedness in a tent. That was only the symptom, the final crack in a foundation that was already broken. The story has always been about something far greater, far more foundational, the arrogant transgression of a sacred boundary. Ham's sin of disrespect was the tremor, but Canaan's crime of theft was the earthquake. His deliberate seizure of a divine inheritance, his willful rebellion against the established order of heaven, was the true source of the curse. And it is a curse whose spiritual consequences have echoed through history, a conflict over holy ground that has never truly ended. This is the forbidden history that was erased from Genesis. They took a story about cosmic treason and reduced it to a tale of family dishonor. They buried the crime of a nation under the shame of a single man. And in doing so, they hid from us a profound truth, that the battles we fight on earth are often reflections of covenants made and broken long ago. The story of Canaan is not just ancient history. It is a timeless warning that the desire to possess what God has not given is a sickness of the soul, a sickness that still infects the heart of our world today. And so the final question we must ask ourselves is this. Now that you know the curse of Canaan was truly a legal sentence for a cosmic crime of theft, how does this change the way you read the rest of the Old Testament? Share your thoughts below.